Welcome to the Be the Change podcast with your host, Ralph Harper. On this podcast, he shares his vision for the future of the United States. Think of this podcast as somewhat of a roadmap to times in the future on a continuum from a dark past to the 2060s. Yep, that's right. He's a forward thinker whose purpose is to dictate positive outcomes for our children and our country versus leaving it all to chance. Ralph will cover parenting, fatherhood, accountability, and what it takes to win in this great nation. It's not just Ralph. He will have difficult conversations with other thought leaders of different backgrounds and political affiliations. It's time to get started. Here's your host, Ralph Harper.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining in today. We have a hot topic that we're going to cover, pride or die. No, I didn't say ride or die, pride or die. Now, to some folks, that topic may be a little bit intuitive. In any case, it has to do with police encounters and police brutality. Police have a lot of authority in the United States. In addition, our laws seem to be designed to overly protect them. In many cases, when it seems pretty obvious on videotape that police officers were in the wrong in terms of the murder of a young person, particularly Black American men, there is rarely a consequence for that. We have to have these kinds of conversations so that people who are victims of police brutality understand that there are certain ways that you must comport yourself in order to mitigate that chance of being a victim of police brutality. Black Americans fall victim to police authority in our country far more than any other race group here. Far too many times, Black American men, women, and children pay with their respective life. It seemed that with each encounter where there was an African American male shot and killed by a white police officer during the entire President Obama term, the common response from police chiefs around the country and responses from actually the President of the United States, President Obama, they were quick to remind us that only 2% of cops in the United States are bad cops. So let's do the simple math. They also suggest that there are approximately 1 million cops in the United States. 2% of 1 million is 20,000 bad cops. When you take 20,000 bad cops and divide it by the 50 states, then that means that there are approximately 400 bad police officers in each state within the United States borders. Now, from my perspective, that seems to me to be a lot of damn bad cops. The question is, when the 98% of good cops protect the 2% of bad cops with their silence, are the 98% of those cops complicit in the actions of the 2% of the bad cops? I guess another way to put it is the 98%, are they bad cops as well? The purpose of this commentary is to send a very clear message to young Black American young men. I need to send a clear message to them about a notion that if you allow your pride to get in the way of you doing what's necessary to mitigate any chance of being a victim of police brutality, the outcome could be fatal. And it could become a question of whether you make a conscious choice to sustain your pride or die at the hands of a bad police officer in the United States. Young Black American men have an inextricable accountability to preserve their own lives. Conversely, young Black American men's parents have an inextricable accountability to guide their children so that they are equipped with the knowledge and with the wherewithal to comport themselves in the right way when they encounter a police officer. Whether it's a good police officer or a bad police officer, quite honestly, there's no real way to know. when you encounter a police officer. So I suggest it just makes sense to behave in a way that will enhance your chance of surviving that encounter. Black American people live a different brand of citizenship in the United States of America. Police brutality just happens to be a microcosm of that unique brand of citizenship that Black Americans are forced to live in this country. But the unique brand of citizenship that I talk about is bigger, it's broad, and there's a lot going on within that realm. For instance, when Labor Department started to track the unemployment rate for Black American people has been double the national average. There have been actual cases where major banks have been caught charging higher interest rates to Black American people than they do people of other races. There has always been discrimination against Black American people in terms of housing, and the list goes on. It seems during President Obama's 2 terms as president, the number of young African American men who were shot and killed by police officers spiked. The whole experience was uncanny. Were these killings a response to the amazing citizens of the United States of America elected a Black American president? I don't know, but it's a fair question to ask. You may recall Terrence Crutcher on September 16th, 2016, was shot in Tulsa, Oklahoma by Officer Betty Shelby as he was walking away from the police officers with both his arms in the air and his hands high above his head. Philando Castile was killed on July 6th, my birthday, in 2016, in Minnesota. He had been pulled over apparently for a busted taillight. Geronimo Yanez shot Castile twice in his chest, killing him while he sat in his car reaching for his wallet. Walter Scott. Scott was killed on April 4th, 2016, in North Charleston, South Carolina. Officer Michael Slager shot Scott in the back 5 times as he ran away from the police officer. Young Tamir Rice was shot and killed on November 22nd, 2014 in Cleveland. Officer Timothy Loham was actually in training and responding to a young boy playing with a toy gun. Eric Gardner on July 17th, 2014 in New York City was literally choked to death on a New York street by Officer Daniel Pantaleo. Michael Brown on April 9th, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson. While this list is not complete, it represents a snapshot of Black American men who were shot and killed by police officers during the Obama reign as President of the United States. The question of whether police brutality in our country is systemic is a fair question to ask. I think so because the numbers and the disparity tell a very compelling story. Consider this. In the early 1990s, several states and the United States government imposed what they referred to as 3-strike laws. Basically, this meant that any person who committed 3 felonies, and if one of those felonies just happened to be very high level, judges around the country had no choice but to sentence these individuals to life in prison. There were thousands of Black American men who were caught up in that process and who are currently incarcerated as a consequence of these laws. Remember, the Stand Your Ground laws basically gave ordinary citizens the right to shoot and kill anyone they perceived a threat on the street. And again, African American people turned out to be and continue to be victims of that level of law, or should I say lawlessness. The United States government seemingly purposely and strategically imposed lighter sentences for people who were using powder cocaine versus people who were using crack cocaine. And as it turned out, minorities were sentenced at a higher level for using cocaine because they were the ones apparently who were using crack cocaine. And the people who were using powder cocaine just happened to be white American citizens. Again, minorities and black American people were incarcerated with harsher sentences for using crack cocaine versus using powder cocaine, while white men and white people in general seem to get off very lightly for using powder cocaine. This number is really, to me, just staggering. Black American men represent approximately 6% of the population. Black American men represent 34% of people incarcerated in the United States of America. The United States population represents approximately 5% of the world population. However, the United States incarcerates 25% of people incarcerated in the entire world. So as our citizenry touts notions of freedom and notions of inalienable rights, the United States of America is in many ways unforgiving. One bad mistake in this country could cause you to be extracted from the society for the rest of your life. But I can't imagine there's any other example more compelling than what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri. I had a chance to read portions of the report that was published from the Eric Holder Department of Justice. And it was one of the most shocking things I have ever read in my entire life. In fact, when I read that report, I was unable to finish it. In Ferguson, Missouri, from the top of the leadership to the bottom of the organization, these folks were systemically arresting Black American people, men, women, and children, for the sole purpose of financing the city of Ferguson. Black American citizens in Ferguson, Missouri were forced into a cycle of courtroom appearances and paying fines that were out of the roof. Fines that they obviously could not afford, but forced to do so or spend time in jail. So these are the realities in the Black American community. I have delineated some of the issues with police brutality in our country. I have made my very best attempt to point out reasons why it's important to keep your pride in check for the purpose of existing in the United States. And now, because I'm so concerned, I'd like to ask young Black American men to follow a few rules. These are the kinds of rules that I think a lot of Black American parents talk to their kids about around the dinner table at night. But it's important, and it's the kind of message that needs to be delivered to young Black American men, because they could be victims. And again, I'll say it again, we need to do everything to ensure that our young children are mitigating any chance of being victims of police brutality. The numbers I have given them to you, but it's up to you to do something with that information. And also it's up to you to do something with these several rules I'm about to give you. I want to make it clear to you. I am a grown man, and I can tell you right now, I am fearful of police in the United States. I just am. I am always determined to get out of an encounter with a police officer with my body and my life still intact. So this message is to African American men and African American children and African American mothers as well, because I think that parents in general have an accountability, as I've said before, to get this kind of information to our young children so that they know what to do when they encounter a police officer. They need to understand the authority that police officers have, and they need to understand clearly how they should be comporting themselves in the presence of a police officer. You may encounter the absolute nicest and best police officer in the world, but you don't know that until you encounter that police officer and you get an idea of how that police officer is treating you. So follow these rules. First of all, first and foremost, you should never, do not run from a police officer. Do not run from a police officer. Always respect the authority of a police officer. Every single police officer you encounter, respect their authority. You can start by referring to the police officer as sir or ma'am or officer. Be sure to follow all the instructions of every single police officer you encounter. Do not deviate in any way from their instructions. When a police officer asks you a question, answer the question with respect and speak very clearly, keeping in mind that you do have a right to remain silent. If it's not too late, do not keep your phone in your hand. In addition, do not attempt to put your phone away while the police officer is approaching your vehicle. If you decide it's necessary to record your incident with the police officer, be careful not to do it in a way that may be perceived threatening to the police officer. And ideally, you should turn your recording device on prior to the police officer reaching your car and speaking with you or working with you through the window of your vehicle. Always keep your hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. If for whatever reason you have a weapon on your person or in the car, while your hand is still at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, be sure to inform the police officer of the fact that you have a weapon. You should never abruptly get out of your car. You should never use profanity during any encounter with a police officer. Please keep your attitude in check. And finally, if for whatever reason you are being arrested or in the process of being arrested, do not resist arrest. Do not complain to the police officer. At that point, the absolute best thing that you could do is to remain quiet, remain silent, and go through the process of being arrested and deal with everything later. Keep your pride in check. At the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned the fact that there were always two sides of a story. When I was planning to move to Texas from New York, I had no idea where Plano, Texas was. For some reason, I assumed it was a small little hick town in Texas somewhere. But it was where Frito-Lay was, and I was moving here to work with Frito-Lay. I was in part right. When I moved here, there was a lot of farmland in really bizarre places. And while Plano is a very different place now, it was a little bit bizarre back then, having these major corporations like EDS and Countrywide and JCPenney and Frito-Lay and PepsiCo near and within less than a half mile, less than a quarter of a mile, some pretty significant farmland. A lot of the roads had not been completely built out yet. So I finally moved here with my wife and my son Cody. And one day when I was leaving Frito-Lay and headed back to my house, a police officer turned his lights on, pulled in behind me, and I immediately assumed I'm in this hick town and this is not going to be a good encounter. The officer pulled up behind me, and the other thing I assumed was that in this small hick town, there's going to be this white police officer who's going to come in, and he's not going to be very nice to me at all. So as I sat in my car and waited on the police officer to approach my vehicle, again, I had my hand at 10 and 2 on my steering wheel. I proactively rolled the window down. And when I looked out my rearview mirror on the left door, the police officer that got out of the patrol car, was this black American guy. And I looked back and I was like, oh, wow, I was shocked. I didn't say anything because I was in the car by myself, but I thought in my head, wow, I just wasn't expecting that. The police officer came to my car, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Sir, why did you choose to ignore that red light?" I offered my simple argument and said, hey, listen, I didn't think the light was red. I thought it was yellow. It may have turned red after I passed it, but from my vantage point, I thought the light was yellow. We had a short exchange, but the interesting thing about this encounter was the fact that this Black American police officer referred to me as sir. When he took my license and he took it back to the vehicle, he came back to the car and he referred to me as Mr. Harper. He gave me the citation that he thought I had earned. And while I disagreed with him, I never argued the point. As he was leaving, he said to me, "Have a nice day, Mr. Harper." I don't think I had ever had an experience like that before in my entire life with a police officer. But that's not the end of it. I have no idea why I have kept track of every single police encounter I've had in Plano, but I have. I have been stopped by police officers in Plano a total of 6 times. After the Black American police officer stopped me, I was stopped by 4 white police officers over the span of probably 10 years. Not a single one of those white police officers gave me a citation. They all gave me warnings. The first police officer, the very first of the 4, he stopped me on February 3rd, 2008. I had been enjoying the New York Football Giants beat up on the New England Patriots to win the Super Bowl. We had fun that night. And then I was driving home. I intentionally took the back roads because there wasn't much development in Plano and north of Dallas. So I intentionally took the back roads. And as I was driving and I was on the main street that heads straight to my house, I was less than 5 minutes away from my house, and I was driving, and there was a police officer sitting in the turn lane on the opposite side of the road. As soon as I passed that police officer, he turned his lights on and pulled in behind me. And I can tell you, this was on one of the most desolate, darkest roads in Plano. Again, the area wasn't developed, so there weren't any street lights or anything. It was just starkly dark. This police officer stopped me. I did my thing. I put my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I rolled the window down. He came up to the car and he started asking me questions. Asking me my name. I gave him my name, gave him my license. Again, he referred to me as sir with each encounter, with each statement he made. Once he took my license, he started calling me Mr. Harper. Then he asked me, he says, "Sir, Mr. Harper, where are you coming from? Where are you going?" I said, "Well, actually, I was leaving my friend's house from watching the Super Bowl, and I'm headed home." He says, "So who's your team?" I said, "Well, actually, I'm a Giants fan." And he looked at me and he says, "Mr. Harper, this is not going to be a good night for you." I said, "Why, officer?" He says, "Well, I'm a Cowboys fan. And the Giants are in our division. And the Giants beat us to make it to the Super Bowl in the playoffs." And I shook my head and I said, "Yes, officer, I know." He looked at me with this weird little smirk on his face. He gave me my license back. He took both of his hands, and as my window was rolled down and my hands were still at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, he took both of his hands, he hit the inside of the door, on the top of the door where the window was, and he said, "Mr. Harper, get the hell out of here." I said, "Okay, officer." And just as he was turning to walk away and go back to his patrol car, he said to me, he says, "Mr. Harper, get home safely." After the officer left, I drove the last 5 minutes to get to my house. And I have never, I don't believe, ever encountered that police officer again. But I can tell you I was stopped by 3 other white police officers in Plano within that 10-year window. And again, those 3 officers all gave me warnings. They never gave me a ticket. Probably about 2-3 years ago, the 6th police officer in Plano stopped me for making an illegal U-turn, but nothing changed. He referred to me as sir. Once he took my license, he referred to me as Mr. Harper. And in this case, that police officer issued me the citation I had earned. He continued to be cordial. So did I. And again, as he was leaving after he gave me the citation, he said to me, Mr. Harper, I got to tell you the reason that we put that new no U-turn sign up there is because the traffic coming from Spring Creek is a little bit fast, and there have been a few accidents. But before he left my vehicle, he said to me again, be careful, Mr. Harper. Have a nice day. I returned the favors and wished him a nice day as well. And then I went on my way and went back home and took care of the ticket. Over the next few weeks, I decided to take a course. But I tell those stories because my experience in Plano has been starkly different than other places. Starkly different than what I read about and what I saw on television in terms of the stuff that happens in a city like Ferguson. And it makes me just realize that, when stuff like that is happening, one of the things that you have to combat that level of police brutality in terms of how police officers treat you is you have the power to make a very conscious choice to move. You have the power to make a very conscious choice to move from that geography and to a city that's more inviting and more appreciative of people who just happen to be different. I have finally reached that place where I'm very comfortable saying publicly that I'm a writer, and I write a lot about hope. I write a lot about the future of our country, which involves me writing about children and the fact that they are the ones who will grow up to be adults and own the change that happens in the future. In this regard, I'm very hopeful for our country. I just don't believe that police brutality and notions of inequality will be sustained going forward. And I don't believe that because I know that our children will have very different agendas going forward. And I'm particularly interested in the next 50 years as we go forward to the 2060s. And I just believe that. I'm very hopeful about the United States of America. And I know that everybody in our country is not bad. And I know that there are factions of people in our country, or there's a large faction or a significant faction of people in our country who will hate me for no other particular reason than the fact that I just happen to be Black American. But everybody is not like that. 69 million people voted for President Obama to become president of the United States of America. The majority of those people were white American people. And then 65 million people, United States citizens, voted for Barack Obama to be president of the United States for a second term. And again, the majority of those people were white American people. Finally, I will say in absolutely no uncertain terms, our country will be okay. We just have to own the accountability to teach our children and to teach them well and to ensure that they grow up with the right values, because they are the ones who will be responsible for owning the change. They will be the change. Thank you so much. Be blessed.
Thank you for joining us on Be the Change. Be sure to subscribe today and don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best conversations. Visit ralphharper.com for show notes, resources, and events. To support Be the Change, please join our patron community at patreon.com/Ralph Harper. Be the Change returns the same time next week and is brought to you by the 2060s Project.